You must know how inspired I am by hearing Lydia Chavez Thompson not just introduce me, but tell you a little about the great leadership that she has provided, not just in the labor movement, but across this country, and particularly in the area of racial reconciliation. Thank you, Lydia, for those words. Thank you for your kind words about me. Let me thank all of you for letting me participate with you in this conference today. I know some of you must be wondering, as I am, what in the world is an old 90-year-old ex-segregationist white governor of Mississippi doing here in Tulsa at a meeting like this? Well, I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here because of this man right here. John, your distinguished father, has meant more to me than I can possibly articulate today. Lydia has referred to our trip across the country on Air Force One with President Bill Clinton, with Dr. John Hope Franklin chairing the committee on which we sat. Let me tell you something. My life changed that night. I spent 3.5 to 4 hours on Air Force One crossing the United States of America, sitting next to Dr. John Hope Franklin. And the conversation I had with him taught me more than a semester at Ole Miss had in terms of what being an American citizen ought to be. He has been my inspiration for a long time. I had never met him, but of course I had read much of which he had written and had followed his distinguished career for a long time. But to get to be with him, as Lydia has just said, to get to be with him, with Lydia, with our other colleagues, and that experience on President Clinton's advisory board changed my life. And so I am honored beyond my ability to express to be invited here to this symposium and to talk with you about what we all need to do now to make the dreams that Dr. Franklin dreamed all his life a reality. We've come a long way, but I can tell you we still have a long way to go. And so I'm assuming that this is why we're here. Not just to talk as I'm talking now, but to really find out what each one of us can do to make this the kind of country that I think all of us want it to be, but which I'm afraid it is falling short of achieving. So let me talk briefly today out of my own life and out of my own experience about the politics of reconciliation. Having spent much of my adult life in the often harsh and uncompromising atmosphere of Southern elective politics, I made 3 races for governor before I was finally elected. I was defeated twice for governor because I was perceived as being too liberal on the issue of race. And I finally made it. But that was a mean political atmosphere in which I grew up, in segregationist Mississippi. And so I have been searching ever since for how we can work together to diminish the myriad conflicts that have arisen out of the issue of race. I'm encouraged. I must tell you, I am encouraged, as I know you are, by the progress that we have made in all the races in reducing some of those conflicts. I have felt for a long time that it would be helpful if we could assess that progress, not through rose-colored glasses, but assess that progress in a realistic way. I have come to believe now that whereas the South, the southern part of this country, was particularly negative in terms of race relations, I have come to believe that there is not much difference now among the regions of this country. We're all dealing with the same problem, and I hope we're looking at it through the same eyes. So as I was giving thought to those issues, after I left the governor's office, I talked to my friend and colleague, former colleague, Bill Clinton. He and I served as governors of our respective states at the same time. Arkansas and Mississippi shared a similar history in terms of race relations. And we compared notes on a number of occasions. And had long felt concern over our failure to eliminate the remaining barriers that kept us from achieving our full potential. He had as one of his predecessors in Arkansas as governor, Orville Forbes. I had as one of my predecessors, and frankly one I defeated for governor later, Ross Barnett. We both understood the tragic ramifications of a politically imposed closed society, which we had both fought to end. So shortly after President Clinton's re-election in 1996, I called him up one day and I encouraged him to consider establishing a special advisory committee to attempt to measure the state of race relations in America. He enthusiastically endorsed that idea and, as Lydia said, put in place a committee, a 7-member committee, the Advisory Board on Race. And it was chaired by the distinguished historian, Dr. Franklin. As a member of that committee, I found this to be one of the most challenging and eye-opening experiences that I'd ever had. I know Lydia shares that attitude. Under Dr. Franklin's leadership, we set out on our mission, which involved countless public meetings and individual conversations with people of every conceivable racial background in every area of the country. I personally visited 26 states in the course of our work. And I came to appreciate fully for the first time the fascinating diversity of the citizenry of our country and the potential strength that diversity brought. I found that while the greatest challenge in race relations had historically been that between black and white people, there now had emerged a racial diversity that is much more complex. In terms of demographics, there has been a huge increase in the numbers of Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans. So a year and a half of intensive effort by our committee produced some conclusions that were both heartening and disturbing. It was obvious that tremendous progress had been made in the advancement of educational and career opportunities, but the economic and educational gap remained unacceptably wide. far greater social integration was taking place, but there was still too much lack of trust between the races and too much so-called white flight. There was a huge difference in the perception of how far we had come. White people seemed to think that we'd come farther than black people did. But of all the forums that we held across the country, it was the one on the campus of my alma mater, the University of Mississippi, that led to some of the most positive and interesting results. On a cold, rainy February night, a racially diverse crowd of almost 1,000 students, faculty, and citizens from the surrounding area gathered in historic Fulton Chapel on the university campus. It was a passionate and candid but civil discussion lasting more than 2.5 hours. It was the first time that a meeting like that had been held on that campus, where some 35 years before a tragic riot had taken place when 3 people were killed over the admission of one black student. At that meeting that night in Fulton Chapel on the campus at Ole Miss, one angry questioner stood up and said, "I want you to tell me why I can't wave my rebel flag at Ole Miss football games." And 2 young ladies, 2 students, one white and one black, stood up and told him why. That it was offensive, that it hurt many people. And we didn't need a flag. We didn't need a flag that was divisive. We needed a flag that was unifying. And that same person later became a leader in our fight to change the state flag in Mississippi and take that battle flag out of it. That's the kind of discussion that we need to have more of. We need to tell people what they must do in order to create the unity that this country ought to bring. It was obvious that the opportunity that night for free and open discussion of race needed to be continued. And so in the ensuing weeks, with the support of the university's chancellor, Robert Khayat, the framework for a permanent organization was put in place, and that idea has now emerged in the form of the Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation based at Ole Miss, that's doing some very good work, I can tell you, in reconciling racial differences in communities across the South. It's demonstrated how the opening of honest conversation between people of different races reveals how much we have in common and how much we can do together. The work of the Institute has led to highly satisfying and successful efforts in many communities, building bridges of understanding and trust to replace the suspicion and hostility that had previously existed. One of the most dramatic results was the creation in Neshoba County, Mississippi, of a multiracial coalition. That county where 3 civil rights workers were horribly murdered in 1964. And as a result of the coalition's efforts, one of the murderers was belatedly brought to justice and convicted of his horrific crimes. Through the years, there had been no effort to do anything about that. And our coalition came together and got the people of that county to get the district attorney to get an indictment against this fellow, and he got him convicted, and he's still serving time. To show you how things have changed in that county, which was dominated by the Ku Klux Klan back in the 50s and 60s. In Philadelphia, Mississippi, the county seat of Neshoba County, which is a white majority city, incidentally, 3 years ago elected a black mayor in a city with a white majority. That's how far we've come, and it has come about as a result of conscious, direct effort in bringing people together. The work of our institute continues at an increasingly effective level. That in communities that were so long imprisoned behind the wall of a closed society, these encouraging models of racial cooperation that are being created in Mississippi, I hope will serve to instruct other communities across the nation, just as this great John Hope Franklin Center is doing here in Tulsa. And I hope that our two institutions can work more closely together to bring together the strength that I think is involved in what you're doing here. On the basis of my participation in some of the numerous forums and conversations that the Clinton Advisory Board had across the country over some 18 months, I learned a great deal. And I found this to be the most important thing I learned. I found that there was a clear consensus around several common concerns, all of which I think form the basis for racial reconciliation. And here's what they were. Regardless of where we were, whether in South Los Angeles, where the riots started back in the 90s, in South Chicago, in Boston, in Miami, in the Mississippi Delta, there were certain basic propositions that almost everybody agreed on. I don't care what they looked like, where they came from, what the economic status was. There were 5 things I found that everybody agreed on. The first thing they agreed on was that they wanted their children to get the best education they could. That was universal. Secondly, everybody wanted a fair chance at getting a job that would enable them to sustain their family. Thirdly, everybody wanted to be able to live in a decent house on a safe street. Fourthly, everybody wanted to have access to some kind of affordable health care. And finally, and most importantly of all, everybody wanted to be treated with dignity and respect. Now, why can't we come together, not just in the spirit of racial reconciliation, but I think this would be at the heart of that spirit, but in the pursuit of equality of life that would serve everybody in this country? Why can't we come together in a good faith effort to try to bring about the realization of these very reasonable aspirations that all of us have? We must make this our national political commitment. When we make the achievement of these objectives our highest priority, we will then have found the key to our national purpose. In the pursuit of those aims, our preoccupation with simplistic and irrelevant issues and differences will fade away. And we can begin to accept the reality that we all want pretty much the same thing, and that we are all members of one race, the human race. We can't forget, though, as we seek to embrace our common humanity, that we must also face the reality that there are forces, many of them unfortunately political, in this increasingly complex country that threaten to continue to divide us. That means that now that the stakes are higher and the issues are more complicated, it is more vital than ever that we have the informed and responsible participation of all of us, not just all of us in this room, but all of us in this country, in the molding and shaping of public understanding and public opinion in a way that will bring us together. Not separate us, but will bring us together. And this participation must be motivated not by a quest for political or private advantage or personal profit, but by a public recognition that only through a shared vision can we achieve our greatest success. And we must build on that vision. We must build on the success that has already enhanced the quality of life for all of us in this room and for so many of our fellow citizens. Now, the difference between now and the simpler world in which I grew up is that in the past, many people had limited skills and limited access to knowledge. But now we have so many people, many more people, with unlimited access to information and the internet and the other processes of communication, but who struggle over how to apply that information in a truly constructive and meaningful way. Unless we learn how to arrive at wise and thoughtful solutions to the issues that confront us, we shall continue to struggle and to be haunted by fears and doubts about our future in a new and hostile world. The irony is that even though we have put behind us so much of what had been wrong and have achieved this greatly increased level of material affluence and productivity, rather than automatically producing a better society, we are finding instead a disturbing lack of civil discourse and an increase of political rancor. There's a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, and a predisposition to getting while the getting is good. In our self-centered preoccupation with our private interests, we tend to forget that we are bound together by a social contract that requires us to get along with each other and to look out for each other. We cannot forget the admonition of those wise leaders such as Dr. Franklin, who have done so much to change our country for the better and who have helped preserve its noblest qualities. We cannot permit these reservoirs of leadership to be taken over, to be succeeded by those with the fattest checkbooks or those concerned solely with their own narrow, selfish agendas. We cannot let greed overwhelm the generous and liberal spirit that has marked our progress in this country. And that is why all of us must be involved with citizens across our land to mobilize that spirit of community and goodwill that still exists in abundance, but that so often gets shunted aside by the political hucksters and the fast buck fortune seekers. We must work to develop more public and community leaders with a vision and civic courage that will enable them to confront and deal with difficult public issues, whether on race relations, education, housing, health care, before they spiral out of control. We must work to create a climate where our political leaders will better be able to act decisively on vital issues instead of feeling that they must draw ideological lines in the sand and pander to the most selfish and cynical of their constituents or kowtow to the shameless peddlers of influence. It's a sad commentary on our so-called enlightened society when the inane and preposterous opinions expressed on talk radio, on some television shows, and now on the internet appear to have more acceptance among much of the body politic than thoughtful voices of reason and compassion. So many people work in lonely and isolated situations without the benefit of wise and knowledgeable advisors. We need all the help we can get to protect us from the raw and uncompromising pressures of biased or uninformed public opinion. that rob us of our individuality and distort our minds. We must do more to make reasonable and conciliatory voices heard. We must support and encourage honest, conscientious public officials to take principled stands, even when those stands may not follow the latest public opinion polls. None of us ought to expect politicians to deliver everything we want, but we have a right to expect, I think, a right to expect from those politicians more than pandering and pussyfooting. In the increasingly complex and diverse society in which we live, very few public issues have clear-cut answers. It is the test of the true leader to find a way to accommodate differences in a reasonable and responsible way. Honorable compromise has always been a necessary element in political leadership. Some naive people regard it as a sign of weakness. Actually, it may involve great courage. It involves recognizing that most issues have two or more sides. Otherwise, we wind up with nothing getting done. This kind of political gridlock that we're seeing these days is a formula for disaster. We must remember that none of us has a totally clairvoyant view of the problem that confront us. For most of us, our perceptions and opinions have emanated from our life experiences and the influences of our family and our teachers and our writers and our public leaders. We must therefore understand how important it is to use that acquired knowledge, plus our own common sense, to weigh and explore and be open to new and better ideas and ways of doing things. We must not be afraid to examine the bases of our beliefs. Visionary and courageous teachers like James Silver, my history professor at Ole Miss, have helped deliver me and all of us from a society of closed minds. I don't have to tell you that that's not an easy road. My friend Jim Silver, who wrote The Closed Society, was drummed out of the University of Mississippi for being friendly to James Meredith, who was the first black student there. So we obviously do not live in the kind of closed society that I once knew, but we do live in a society that still has too many closed minds that are oblivious to the needs of so many of our fellow human beings. The paradox is that after seeing so much positive change that has helped right many of the old wrongs, we find ourselves now facing the situation that a gifted Mississippi writer that many of you may be familiar with, named David Cone. He once predicted that this could be our fate. With heaven in sight, he said, we insist on marching perversely into hell. Now, at a time when we should be looking forward with confidence to the continuation of an era of economic stability and social progress, we find ourselves facing some of the most difficult circumstances that any of us have ever known. How did this happen after we have come so far? Thomas Wolfe perhaps put it best in his book, You Can't Go Home Again, written at the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s, a time not unlike the present. This is what Wolfe wrote then. I believe that we are lost here in America, but I believe we shall be found. I think the enemy is here before us. I think the enemy is people and enslaved them. Then he polluted the fountains of our life, took unto himself the rarest treasures of our possession, took our bread. Too much poetic license on that. But we have let too much of our public decision-making be influenced by those concerned mainly with their own narrow agendas. We've let greed overwhelm the generous spirit that has inspired much of the progress in the past. And we let our minds be closed to the concept that we live under that social contract expressed in the Declaration of Independence when we pledge to ourselves our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We've come through a lot of tough times in the past, come through the Depression of the 30s that I still remember, come through those civil rights battles of the 60s, come through all kinds of threats to our national security. But I must tell you this, a fearful or suspicious or selfish people cannot be a free people. And we must live in the confidence and reassurance that is the basis of our freedom. We cannot always be sure that we are right, and we cannot be so proud and insecure that we cannot admit that sometimes we might be wrong. We must see to it now, particularly that our young citizens have a clearer understanding of where we have come from and who we are as a people and how we got where we are. There's not enough of this teaching and learning going on. Too many of our most able and promising young men and women have only a passing acquaintance with the events and heroes who shaped our history. Much as I hate to say it, the name, I taught 4 years as an adjunct professor at historically black university, Mississippi Valley State University in the Delta, Mississippi. I hate to say this, 90% of the young black students in my classes over there couldn't tell me who John Hope Franklin was. Now, something's wrong with our education system when that happens. Now, one thing our institute has done, it has sponsored legislation in the Mississippi legislature that requires the inclusion of our curriculum in our public schools of studies involving specifically civil rights and the history of the civil rights movement. It's not incorporated in any one subject. It's included in an integration of all the subjects that are being taught. And that's working. It's working where the local school superintendents want it to work. And that's in most of the school, and it is making a difference. But this lack of civic learning and understanding of our historical background can be a fatal flaw in the capacity of our future leaders to lead. Without a knowledge of what has gone on before, they may well fall into the trap of repeating the old mistakes and ignoring the lessons that earlier generations have paid so dearly to learn. They must clearly understand, and I'm talking about our young people, they must clearly understand that public and civic leadership is never an easy road to travel. There are a lot of stresses and strains. It's easy for people to get split up over things. There are full-time practitioners, I can tell you, there are full-time practitioners in politics and in the media, and even in some church groups, who fan the flames of emotion and discord. We must not let ourselves succumb to the tendency to demonize those who see things through different eyes, based usually on different life experiences. Sometimes we have to walk in someone else's shoes for a while to understand where that person is coming from. My perspective is that the best way to overcome these stresses is through sharing experiences, working and talking with others, and recognizing that we are all in this together, and that what we have in common is so much greater than the things that divide us. And as we work with other people who may be different from us, the old barriers and old stereotypes begin to fade away. In my lifetime, which now spans almost 9 decades, I find myself reflecting on how fortunate I have been to have lived through some of the most exciting and challenging and possibly dangerous periods in recorded history. After thousands of years of living in relative isolation, we are now living in a world where we can be in instantaneous contact with our fellow human beings in the remotest corners of the earth. There's no place to hide, even if we wanted to, from the realities of our existence together on this planet. And having seen the years of the incredible changes in race relations in my native state and in the South, I'm convinced that it is not totally unrealistic or idealistic to believe that we can achieve similar progress in challenging other elements that divide us and diminish our ability to live together. And this doesn't mean that we have to relinquish our long-held cultural, spiritual, or political beliefs, but it does involve a willingness to accord respect to those who hold different ideas or who come from different backgrounds and life experiences. In other words, we must strive to achieve a society where all of us can feel that we are valued and included. A society or a community built of different and diverse individuals can actually be stronger and more vibrant by virtue of the combining and harmonizing of its different elements. The acceleration and perfection of that advancement should now be the task for our future. Now the time has come. Now the time has come for all of us to join together in embracing the full measure of our common existence and the recognition and appreciation of our common humanity. Thank you very much.